Hi there, welcome to Scoring Opportunity, a Bundesliga Fantasy Manager podcast. I'm your host, Fred. Thanks for tuning in. This show aims to help you with transfer picks, transfer strategy, team construction, and getting your team climbing the overall rank leaderboard. If you have a question regarding Bundesliga Fantasy Manager, you can contact the show via Twitter. The handle is @scoringup_pod. Every week I will be answering your questions on the show, and the ones that don't make it on the air I'll answer directly on Twitter. This is episode 0.5. It's my official test episode, so if you're listening to this, thank you for that, and hopefully you can share your thoughts about this podcast with me so I can improve this show and become a helpful resource for the Bundesliga Fantasy Manager community. On today's show, we'll do a quick review of the past match day and look at some in-form players. Then we'll talk a bit about template teams and take a look at how my own team has done. After that, we'll get into the main segment of today's show. Then I'll answer your listener questions. And as always, I'll close the show with my top 3 differential picks per position, as well as the top 3 one-week punts. First off, we have to talk about what a template team is. Well, it's a term in Fantasy Premier League that applies to Bundesliga Fantasy Manager as well. It basically describes who the top players are picking. Right here, I'd like to give a shout out to the person behind the wonderful website FantasyBL-Stats. The website is chock full of useful information for any fantasy manager, from detailed player stats to predicted lineups and fixture difficulty charts. Their Twitter handle and full web address can be found in the show notes. This is a must-use resource for any fantasy manager. Getting back on track, a template team in Bundesliga Fantasy Manager is a team which consists of the most picked players from the leading 500 managers. This doesn't mean you should just go out and buy those players, because you won't have the budget for it. But it's a great look into the minds of the most successful managers this season, and any manager worth their salt needs to have the template team in the back of their minds. Bundesliga Fantasy Manager, like any game, has a set of rules. To play the game well, and I would think to have more fun, you need to know how to best accumulate points. Sure, you could pick as many of your favorite players as you want, but they may not score a lot of points, or are too expensive, and you could get someone in at a lower price who may be an even better fantasy asset. Take for instance Jan Sommer, the Gladbach goalkeeper. He scored 53 points so far this season, which is pretty good for a goalie. He's owned by 25% of all managers, but he's only owned by 3.6% of the top 500 managers. This is because of his hefty price tag, which is currently $9.2 million. For that money, you can get a cheaper and even better scoring goalkeeper. That'll free up some cash to invest in your outfield players. Manuel Neuer is an even greater example. He's owned by 22% of all fantasy managers, but owned by a whopping 0.2% of the top 500 managers. One of the best goalkeepers in the world? Yes. A good fantasy asset? Not really. So, who's in the current template team right now? Let's start from the back. In goal, we have Fürth's new first-choice goalie, Marius Funk. At $1 million, he's a great bargain, even with the low amount of points he's scored so far. In the second goalie slot, we have Bochum's Riemann. He had a tremendous game last match day, and he's already had another legendary game in which, despite conceding 7 goals against Bayern, ended the match with 5 points due to getting 12 points from saved shots. In defense, you have premium-priced Angelino and Christian Günther, as well as Gieselmann, Frimpong, and Scally from Gladbach, who is the most owned defender among the top 500, while also being the cheapest. In midfield, we have Nkunku, Leverkusen's phenom Wirtz, Frankfurt's only good fantasy asset at the moment, Kostic, as well as Kimmich and Hofmann. This is a premium-only midfield, meaning that all of these players cost more than 12 million. If you want to go for all of these 5 players, you would have to bring in an even cheaper defense than even the one mentioned earlier. The forward line consists of Lewandowski, the most owned player in the entire game, and then the most picked Haaland replacement Schick and Embolo. On to my team. Let's start from the back. Mark Flecken is now my set-and-forget keeper. He shares the top point-scoring spot for goalkeepers with Radetzky, all while costing 1.7 million less. My team ended up in a 3-4-3 formation with Gvardiol, Angelino, and Frimpong as defenders, scoring only 22 points between the three of them. My midfield consisted of Nkunku, Kostic, Wirtz, and Holtmann, who got a lucky 4 points as a sub. The front three were Lewandowski, Schick, and Embolo. It was a disappointing weekend, to say the least. I ended up on 91 points, which was my lowest total this season. I invested heavily into Gladbach and Leverkusen for two reasons. Number one, they both had standalone fixtures, which gave me an extra opportunity to change my star men. And number two, my transfers were forced by injuries to Haaland, Goretzka, and Davies, which led me to bring in three Leverkusen players. I was planning on bringing them in eventually, but gradually, and thought myself lucky to get them all in last weekend, but it just didn't pay off. Gladbach was even worse for me, as they went down to Hertha. I ended up having to take Hofmann and Scally out of my starting lineup. I definitely do not want a repeat of this weekend. My overall rank slipped 50 places down to 114th. In today's main segment, we're going to be taking a look at striker options in light of a slew of injuries to top strikers Haaland, Schick, Weghorst, and Diaby. With Lewandowski in most everyone's team, your second and third striker picks will be determined by your team composition, how you built your team. Especially with Haaland out, we all have a bit more cash to play around with, and you can conceivably afford an all-premium midfield. But if you do have money in the bank, here are some premium striker options for you to consider. We do have to talk about the dreaded Bayern striker double-up. As I'll come back to later in the show, many managers do not want to double up on Bayern strikers, presumably to not fall victim to squad rotation, or in order to capitalize on standalone fixtures, or at the very least, not doubling up strikers in the same time slot. However, the Bayern front line is tearing it up, with all three non-Lewandowski strikers scoring at least 79 points so far. Müller, Sané, and Gnabry are all in the top 7 of best strikers in the game and top 11 in the entire fantasy game. They are unquestionably strong options for your team. Next, let's talk about Kramaric and Royce. The Hoffenheim dropping by Bayern aside, Kramaric has been having a good season fantasy points-wise, albeit not scoring that many goals. But he does rack up points because the Croatian is also valuable creatively, not only scoring a good amount of points for shots, but also for passes to shots. Royce, on the other side, is getting a chance to show that he can still lead the team in the absence of Haaland. The win against Bielefeld was impressive, and Royce is in a similar position as Kramaric in that he scores points in multiple avenues. He gets in the shots, yes, but he's also contributing with assists, passes to shots, and even won duels. These have all been premium-priced options. If you are going for a more expensive midfield or even more expensive defense, there are viable mid-priced options in the striker position for you to consider. Modeste, Awoniyi, Huller, Onisiwo, and Burkhardt will all be mentioned later in the show. Now on to your questions. Thanks again for sending them in via Twitter. Here's one from @InsertName here. Who's the better pick at the moment, Awoniyi or Modeste? I would go for Awoniyi because of both form and fixtures. However, Modeste is averaging 9 points per match and ended a mini drought this last weekend. The last 3 match days, Awoniyi has been bossing the opposition though. He's an exciting player and has rightly been called up for the Nigerian national team. With Union's and Awoniyi's form, I can see Awoniyi being the enabler striker pick for the season. It would then come down to which team has a standalone fixture and against whom. Köln didn't flounder against Leverkusen, and Modeste owners must have been over the moon with his 14 points. But Köln play Dortmund and Union next, 2 more tough fixtures. One last question from @generic_manager. Is it time to get rid of Grifo and Kostic? No, I wouldn't say so. Grifo at 13 million is still a good pick for averaging 7 points per match. So if I had him in my squad, I wouldn't use a transfer to get him out if I had more pressing needs. As for Kostic, who I do have in my team, I am planning on keeping him through till the next international break. Sure, Frankfurt does look like they're playing like they want to get relegated, but Kostic always finds a way to get involved in a match. Let's move on to my top 3 differential picks per outfield position to give you a shot in rising the leaderboards quickly and trouncing your mini-league opponents. Starting in defense, the number 3 slot goes to 2 players, Marc-Oliver Kempf and Konstantinos Mavropanos. Stuttgart will have a standalone fixture against struggling Augsburg and then play Bielefeld in matchday 11 right before another international break and unlimited transfer window. Both these Stuttgart defenders are scoring a lot of points via goals and shots. And although you will likely not get clean sheet points because Stuttgart is conceding a heck of a lot of shots, both these defenders are credible goal and shot threats. My number 2 pick is Danilo Soares from Bochum. He scored big in their win over Frankfurt last matchday and has consistently shown his attacking intent, racking up a total of 60 points so far this season, making him Bochum's best outfield player in the game. At number 1, we have Freiburg's Lukas Kübler. He is the wingback partner of Christian Günther, who has now all but become essential. But if you can't afford to get in Günther, Kübler is the next best thing. He is owned by only 1% of top 500 owners and less than 0.1% total ownership, which really gives him a differential potential. Just beware that Freiburg play Bayern in matchday 11. My midfield picks start with Dominik Szoboszlai. Although he doesn't start every game, when he is on the pitch, he's super active and a credible threat, as proven by his performance coming off the bench against Fürth. In second place in midfield, you have Wataru Endo. He is a consistent point scorer and as a Stuttgart player has that seemingly tasty standalone fixture against Augsburg next matchday. In the midfield top spot, I recommend Woo Young Jung. Nominally a midfielder, but playing as a striker in real life, he gets an extra point for any goals, assists, and shots he makes. And at a mere 5 million, he's the best bargain midfielder in the game right now. As for strikers, we'll start off with Thomas Müller. Most managers will have Lewandowski in their teams and don't want to double up on Bayern strikers, but Müller consistently amasses fantasy points to the point where we ask ourselves, why didn't we have him in our teams from the start of the season? The second spot goes to Lukas Höhler. Last year, he was outshone by the emergence of Demirovic on a good Freiburg side. This season, Höhler is contributing to an even better Freiburg side, and he looks like a much better player in the process. He scored more points this season than Weghorst, Silva, or Plea, and they're all struggling for game time. In the top striker spot, I recommend Karim Onisivo. Both he and Burkhardt had a monster game against Augsburg last matchday, but Onisivo is getting more consistent game time. At 7.4 million, he's a bargain for a striker, and the partnership with Burkhardt looks like a fruitful one for Mainz. That was our show for today. If you have any more questions, feel free to contact me on Twitter. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope to hear from you. My name is Fred, and this has been Scoring Opportunity. Let's have a great match day.